Mentioned Dan not here, so of course he asked me to teach, and I was trying to think of what to teach on. This is something I've done in the past. I don't think it was in this audience, though, so hopefully it'll be new information for you, and if not, maybe it'd be a good refresher. But looking at Bible history, I started this out several years ago. I was teaching a class and came up with talking about Herod the Great, and I wanted to give some background, so I started digging up a little background, and I thought, well, I need to go back a little farther, to help figure out explain where he came from, and before long, I ended up almost to the beginning of Genesis. So I'm going to kind of walk us through the history of the Israelites leading up to the time of Christ. I hope it's good information for you, helps to tie in maybe world events with the Bible. So we'll just dig into that. So if I've got this turned on, let's see. I do, good. All right. I don't know how well you all can read those. Probably the names are a little small there, but this is a rough approximation of the area that was promised to the Israelites when they prepared to enter the promised land, time of Joshua. Determine this picture is probably not quite as accurate. I think it should go up a little farther to the north and a little farther to the south. But anyway, it's roughly the area that they were promised with the divisions of the different tribes and where they were allotted land. Like I said, you probably can't see the actual names of the tribes real well there, but if you can, do some Bible quizzing. What tribe would not be shown on this map getting land? Levi. Why is that? Right. And if you understand why, if you go back to the Mount Sinai, when the Israelites were worshiping the golden calf, the Levites rallied to Moses to help him stop that celebration, as it were, and try to set things right. And God set them aside for himself then as a special tribe, and they were scattered throughout the land of Israel. To be the spiritual guides for everyone. And of course, they also helped at the tabernacle. Again, I don't know if you probably can't read it, but there's another tribe, another son of one of the sons of Jacob that is not on this map. Anybody know which one that is? Joseph. Good. Why is that? That's right. So we got some people on it over here. All right. If you recall, there were 12 sons of Jacob, 12 tribes of Israel, of course. Who was the favorite son? Joseph. Of course, Jacob thought Joseph had been killed when his brothers sold him into slavery. And when he did finally meet him all those years later, Joseph had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and Jacob said, "Your sons count as my sons." So basically, Joseph got a double portion of the land. So we had the tribe of Manasseh and the tribe of Ephraim. They both got their own areas. So Joseph got two areas. So, yeah, I didn't trick anybody with that one. But going back a little bit farther, just to explain this, I mentioned Levi got set apart for God. If you go back all the way to the blessings of Jacob, right before he died, when he was blessing his sons, he singles out Levi and Simeon to be scattered among their brothers. And that was because if you go even farther back, when they first came into Canaan, there was an incident with their sister Dinah and the people of Shechem, specifically one man of Shechem. And to get revenge on them, Levi and Simeon killed all the men of Shechem. And so Jacob, when he was blessing them, said they were people wielding the sword, causing problems, so they're going to be scattered. So Levi got scattered everywhere. Simeon, you notice, is at the very bottom there, and it's inside the land of Judah. It seems to me over time in the Old Testament, the Simeonites basically became completely integrated into Judah, and you really don't even hear about that tribe anymore because they were surrounded by Judah. So anyway, that's where we start out here. And of course, it's in the book of Joshua and Judges and the first part of Samuel. Now, just to explain something here, again, I hope you can see this a little better. We look at a map, we look at two-dimensional maps, and we just see this flat section of country, whatever country we're looking at. Well, Israel is not flat Israel has a very varied landscape, and that plays a big role in how things played out over the future of the Israelites. You've got the Rift Valley, where the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River lie. On either side of that are fairly big mountains, several thousand feet of altitude. And then you get over toward the Mediterranean coast, it becomes a flat land, a plain. And there's some other areas that are valleys, but a lot of it's hill country and mountains. So as the conquest of the Promised Land took place, Joshua led them in the first early conquests, and then he told the tribes, you've got to finish capturing all the land now that I'm getting ready to die. And they didn't really do that. So if you look by the time of Saul's kingdom, and on this map, that's basically the red area, a reddish, pinkish area. The green area is every place they were supposed to capture, but they didn't. And what you find out here is that, go back to this map before, that Central Valley is mountainous. They were able to take the mountains and hold them because they were easy to defend. They were not able to take the flatlands. Those people that lived in the valleys and along the coast were pretty strong. They had chariots, because you could use chariots out in that area. And the Israelites, because they didn't have enough faith in the Lord, they basically gave up. They said, they're too strong for us. And so the places where you had armies that used chariots and horses, the Israelites weren't able to take at this point. So Saul's kingdom was basically confined to the mountains, because that's the only place they could really adequately defend. So the hill country, if you will. So that's the latter part of 1 Samuel, when we read about Saul. Of course, he was continually at war with the Philistines and so forth, but he never took their land completely. Now, time of David, David's more successful. He starts driving out some of those other people, or at least subjugating them. He takes their land and forces them to become slaves to the Israelites. So he gets more territory, he expands it, and gets more of what they were supposed to be able to actually control according to the Lord. So, of course, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, early part is David's life, and that's when we see the kingdom at this point. Now, of course, when he dies, he turns it over to his son Solomon. Now, Solomon has peace. Solomon has a vast amount of control. And this is this map, again, the green is the present area of Israel, which is roughly comparable to what the Israelites controlled back in the 1000 BC or so. But this tan area on this map is showing what Solomon actually had control over. Even if he wasn't the direct ruler, he controlled it through his influence. So he was controlling all the way up into Syria, down to the Persian Gulf, over into Egypt somewhat. He had a vast area that he controlled. And what do we know about Solomon? What are some of his characteristics? I'm sorry? He had wisdom, yes. He asked for wisdom, and God gave him that and everything else. So what are some of the other things he had? He did have a lot of wives, and we'll get to that in a minute too, yeah. What else? Strong. He had a lot of money too, right? Very, very wealthy. And, the Bible tells us he had extreme wealth and sent out ships to collect gold and do all kinds of things. Doesn't necessarily bring out, but what archaeologists and historians think now too is that because he had such control over this large area, that happened to be the place where all the major trade routes went through, from the Persian Gulf up to Syria, Damascus, back the other way, out into the Far East somewhat too. He controlled all those areas, all the roads. And when you controlled the roads for the trade routes, you got money. You could charge those people money. So he had vast wealth, vast influence over this area because he controlled everything. So one of the reasons he has so much money. But, as Brandon mentioned, he also had a whole bunch of wives because he was making all these political alliances. And we know, unfortunately, the story, as he got older, he started building a temple for this wife, a temple for that wife, and whatever their gods were. And before long, he was no longer fully committed to the Lord. And so the Lord punishes him for that. He starts causing people to revolt against him. And then what's he tell him once Solomon dies, what's going to happen? Well, not quite yet. Solomon dies, he's going to take what away from him? His family. Remember? Almost all the tribes are going to be taken away. He's only going to be left with one. So Solomon dies, and his son Rehoboam takes his place. Rehoboam is a much weaker king. And so what we see, oops, too far, there we go. If you can see on this map, we end up splitting the kingdom up. Rehoboam is told he gets left with one tribe. The other 10 tribes go to, it was actually Solomon's leader of his forced labor, which is a guy by the name of Jeroboam. He gets all the other tribes. Now, this map doesn't divide up the tribes in it. It shows it as the kingdom of Judah in the south and the kingdom of Israel in the north. Oops, that wasn't too good, sorry. So one thing falls, everything falls. All right. So Jeroboam gets all those tribes that were to the north. So it's Manasseh and Zebulun and Naphtali and Dan and Gad and so forth. He gets all of them. The kingdom of Judah remains with the line of David, with Rehoboam. And like I said before, that appears to also include Simeon, because Simeon seems to have been integrated into Judah. And it also includes at least part of Benjamin, because Jerusalem actually happens to sit in the area that was allocated to Benjamin. Now, David ended up taking it and making it his capital, but so that little bit probably stayed with Rehoboam too. But for the most part, everybody else went with Jeroboam. So Rehoboam loses all of that. So you have the divided kingdom. Again, it shows there 1 Kings into 2 Kings. Now, the northern tribes kept the name Yisrael, Israel, and then the bottom, the lower kingdom, the southern kingdom, kept the name of Judah, because that was the primary tribe that they controlled. And then, who were the people that lived in Judah called? First part of the word. Jews. Jews. That's the people in Judah were called Jews. That's where we get that term. But one thing I want to point out here, so we've got several things. Now, once the kingdom of Israel was set up in the northern tribes, one of those kings decided he needed a new capital, and he bought some land from a man by the name of Shemer, and they named it after him, and that's where the term Samaria comes from. That was actually the name of the town that they ruled from. Notice there's some other names here too, though. There's some countries that are outside of that area: Ammon, Moab, Edom. So these are names we see throughout history where the Israelites or the Jews were fighting against these people, having struggles with them. And I want to look at where these people came from. So, going all the way back to near the beginning of Genesis, we have a man by the name of Terah. Anybody remember him? Who his sons may have been, especially one of them. Heard something? Abraham was one of them. That is correct. I can say, you're all going to fail if you don't get better than this here. So, very good. He had 3 sons: Nahor, Abram, and Haran. And of course, Abram, we know his name gets changed to Abraham. So this is where they came up out of Ur. Abraham gets called to go to Canaan shortly after this. Now, Haran has a son named Lot. And recall, Abraham and Lot, of course, both travel over to Canaan, to the Promised Land, where they are sojourners. Now, what's the story? Where was Lot? What was he involved with? Sodom, yeah. So he's in Sodom. Sodom gets destroyed. They're called out of there. And they're so terrified after the destruction of those cities that they end up living in a cave. Of course, we know his wife didn't make it. But he and his two daughters end up living in a cave. And this is one of those weird stories of the Bible. Probably don't want to talk about it a lot. But his daughters hatch a plan. They think, well, we're living by ourselves. We don't have anybody with us. The family line's going to die out. So they hatch a plan. Rather, we don't want to talk about it, but it's a incestuous plan to have children by their father. And they have two children. You may remember those names. Ammon and Moab. So that's the two countries we see on the eastern side of Israel and Judah. That's where they came from. So like I said, incestuous, illegitimate children of Lot end up leading or becoming the fathers of these two countries that caused problems to the Israelites years later on. Now, Abraham has a son named Isaac. He has two sons named Jacob and Esau. Jacob's name becomes Israel, struggles with God. Anybody remember what Esau's nickname was? May have heard it. Somebody say it? Edom. He is Edom, which I believe is actually the same name in Hebrew as Adam, but in our English Bibles we change them around some. But anyway, his nickname was Edom, which we have the kingdom of Edom down there on the map. Hopefully y'all can see that. So that's where all these people come from. They're essentially brother nations and or like cousin nations of the Israelites. So we see these names throughout the Bible later on, and that's where they all came from. So going back here, let me go back one. The northern kingdom Israel, led by Jeroboam. Jeroboam, even though God said he would be with him and give him a kingdom for years, if he'd follow him, he doesn't follow the Lord. Immediately sets up idols, takes the people astray, does all kinds of really wicked things. And every single king, if you read about them in the Bible, in 1st and 2nd Kings, of the tribe or the nation of Israel, then, that northern kingdom, every single one of them says evil, that did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. So God eventually raises up the Assyrian Empire to come and attack them. And here, this quote from 2 Kings. The 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, that was the capital city, and deported the Israelites to Assyria. And the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. So the 10 northern tribes get wiped out and scattered abroad, and more people were brought in. So this is the beginning of what we see in the New Testament when they're dealing with the Samaritans. And of course, the Jews didn't like the Samaritans because they were these people that had been brought in, were sort of halfway tried to follow the Mosaic law, but not really, and so obviously caused a lot of tension with the Jews. But that's where they come from here, the Assyrian Empire. So Isaiah was around at this time preaching against what the people were doing. And of course, we know that they didn't listen to him, and ultimately they were led away. So that's the end of the northern kingdom. We still have the southern kingdom. But they also are not always truly devoted, fully devoted to God. And God raises up the Babylonian Empire, which eventually overtakes the Assyrian Empire as the leader of the world, essentially at that point. Nebuchadnezzar, we're familiar with, is the emperor, which we know we see come out various things about him with the book of Daniel. But Nebuchadnezzar attacks all around, conquers a bunch of nations, eventually comes against the kingdom of Judah. And over time, even though there were good kings in Judah, like Hezekiah, like Josiah, there were also some bad kings, and they were also following the pagan culture of the Canaanites that were there before them. And eventually, God allows Nebuchadnezzar to take control of the kingdom of Judah. So we see that 597 BC is the first time he conquers the kingdom of Judah. He takes captives, takes them back to Babylon. People like Daniel and Ezekiel are taken in that time frame. He sets up a puppet king, which is one of Josiah's sons, gives him the name Zedekiah, and for 11 years it's all status quo. Zedekiah is doing what he's supposed to do, which is do whatever Nebuchadnezzar tells him. But eventually he decides he's going to revolt. When you're now a very small, weak kingdom, revolting against the most powerful nation in the world, not a smart thing to do. So Nebuchadnezzar comes back, and in 586 BC, wipes out Jerusalem. That's when the temple is destroyed. Everything is destroyed in Jerusalem. Zedekiah is captured. Nebuchadnezzar kills all his sons in front of him, then gouges out his eyes and takes him back to Babylon, where he remains in prison for the rest of his life. Not a good end. And Jerusalem at this point, like I said, all of Judah is basically desolate. It's been wiped out. As Nebuchadnezzar dies, his son comes to power, was much weaker. He ends up losing control of the kingdom, and you have the Medo-Persian Empire gains control, especially a guy by the name of Cyrus. And it's under Cyrus that the predicted return that Jeremiah told about would start, and the Israelites, the Jews, start going back. They're allowed to go back to Canaan and to start reforming the country again. This is around 538 BC. Under this same Medo-Persian group, that's Esther's time frame, probably 475 BC. A little bit later, around 450, 440 BC, you have Nehemiah and Ezra going back and doing more to rebuild the country of Judah and rebuild Jerusalem. So that's all in this time frame. And it's shortly after this, well, say 100 years later, 330 BC or so, we have the rise of a guy named Alexander out of Macedonia. And we know he conquers everybody he comes across throughout the whole basically known world. So it takes out the Medo-Persians and everybody else, gains control of Canaan. And shortly after he wipes out the world, he dies. And his kingdom gets divided up into among his four main generals. And from a standpoint of the Jews, the two main ones are the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids. That's basically out of Greece, Turkey area. Well, if you got a real powerful group in Greece and Turkey and a real powerful group in Egypt, who's right in the middle of all that? It's the Jews, right there in the middle of the land of Canaan. And so there's constantly armies back and forth. And the Seleucids gained primary control of it for a while. And they really don't care about Jewish culture. They're not worried about temple worship or anything else. But at this point, the temple's been rebuilt. So one particular king in Frank, you may be able to help me out. I think it's Antioch Epiphanes, I believe is his name, Antiochus. He decides he's really going to show the Jews who's boss. He takes a pig to the temple, to the altar, sacrifices it on the altar, and completely defiles the temple. And we obviously know that pork was not, pigs were not allowed in the temple. Jews didn't eat that. So he actually takes a, completely beyond anything the Jews could imagine, sacrifices the pig on the altar. And that was a turning point for some people in Israel. They couldn't take it anymore. So you have the rise of a guy named Mattathias. He was a Sadducee. He was a descendant of Zadok, so he's a priest. And like I said, he'd had enough. So his family starts fighting back against these Greeks. And slowly over time, over several decades, they actually gained control of independence of the old area of Judah and even some of the other areas, even into what the northern kingdom would have been. He has a son named Judas, who had a bunch of brothers. Now Judas apparently was very strong in battle and maybe ruthless. He was given the nickname the Hammer, which in Hebrew is Maccabees. So if you've ever heard of the Maccabees, and there's actually two intertestamental books, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, that's who it's talking about here. Historical books about this family who were known as the Hasmoneans, but again, they became known as the Maccabees because of this one guy and how good a fighter he was. So they actually gained control of the old area of Israel. Throw everybody else out. The unfortunate part is by the time they gained control, they were as bad as the Greeks and the Ptolemies were to start with. They're really not religious at all at this point, even though they're priests. So a few generations later, you have people in charge like Aristobulus, who kills his mother and imprisons all his brothers, and another brother that killed another brother, and in fact, he was, again, I said they were Sadducees, so they start killing off all the Pharisees. They don't like them. So, again, it's a very messy situation. These aren't truly people of God. They're political, just in it for the political power. So anyway, there's some more people here that show up historically. Hyrcanus, Aristobulus. And these two brothers have children who get married. And later on, there's a woman that becomes very important called Mariamne. And we're going to see why she's important here in a minute. But so these are the priests, the priestly line that was in control of the country. And their descendants were the ones who were the Sadducees during the time of Jesus. Now, back up here. Well, you can't read it, but the countries you see now, we still see some of the ones we talked about. There's a Moab up there, you probably can't tell. There's a country here at the bottom, just south of Judea, which we would probably pronounce Idumea, just because it's got an I and an E in it. But these are Greek names, so in Greek, I's are E's and E's are A's, and confuse everybody. So that country that Idumea is actually, or Idumea is Idumea. Idumea, that's our old friend Edom, same country. And that's important because when the Romans get control, which we know took over all of Europe and northern Africa and the part of the Middle East there, they put a man in charge called Antipater, who was an Idumean. He was an Edomite. And they gave him control of Judea. Guess what the Jews thought of that? They weren't real happy. He's an Edomite. They don't like Edomites. But that's who's in charge of them now, because the Romans are in control. So, this man Antipater has a couple of sons, one of whom is named Herod. Herod the Great, which shows up in the Gospel of Matthew, of course. He marries Mariamne. He's trying to get some legitimacy with the Jews, so he marries a woman from the priestly line of the Jews, a Sadducee, trying to, like I said, make the Jews happy in a way. Now Herod, again, the Romans gave Antipater the control of the country. He turns it over to his sons. There was some infighting there for a while and some problems, but eventually Herod gets the Roman Senate on his side, and he is named King of the Jews, if you remember that. So when Jesus shows up as King of the Jews, he's a little concerned. And I'll say, we're going to see here in a minute, Herod the Great may have been the most paranoid person in the history of the world. Anybody he thought might want to come after his power, he was going to kill. So in his family line here, his wife's grandfather he has murdered, and his wife's father he has murdered. Wife's other grandfather was a high priest. He first cuts his ears off so he can't be high priest anymore because then he was mutilated. But then that wasn't good enough, so he had him executed anyway. Then he executes her uncle. And lastly, he executes her. He executes his favorite wife because he was worried she might try to usurp his power. So this is Herod the Great. Now, Herod the Great was the great builder one of the great builders of the ancient world. This is where, again, I said he was very paranoid. He built strongholds throughout the land of Canaan so that he could run and hide if he needed to, if somebody came after him. Masada is one of them. You all probably heard of that. It's an area that not far from En-Gedi. There's even some speculation because Masada means fortress in Hebrew. And you go back to the Psalms, and in David's time, he talks about going up to the fortress. There is some potential that David even used this area as a hiding place. Can't guarantee that. But anyway, Masada is one of the places that Herod built up. Of course, he didn't build the mountain, but he built stuff on top of it. And there's storerooms up there. We got to go there when we were in Israel. It's a pretty amazing place. You're in the middle of the desert, 2 inches of rain a year. So they kept all the food they could need. This was a structure at the far end of Masada. Anybody have an idea what that might be in the middle of the desert? Doesn't have a roof on it. Well, they had a huge cistern that kept the rain. This was actually a swimming pool. They had so much water in the middle of the desert that he built a swimming pool for himself. There's part of his palace on the front of it. But another place that Herod built up was Caesarea Maritima. It's a town that shows up quite a bit in the New Testament because that was the main port. Philip the evangelist goes through there. Cornelius the centurion was there. This was also where Herod had one of his palaces. That's the place where they got their water. They had a big chariot racing venue. This is the remains of Herod's palace. This is where Paul would have been held prisoner at Caesarea in the latter part of Acts. But go ahead and give a little fuller piece of Herod and the people that we see in the New Testament. Sorry. So I mentioned before he'd married this woman named Mariamne. He actually had probably as many as 10 wives, but there were 5 that were important. That's the most important ones. That's these listed here: Doris, Mariamne the second. I guess that's after he killed the first one. Malthus and Cleopatra, but it's not that Cleopatra. It's a different one. But you can see they have various sons and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Now, I'm going to put these boxes up here. Anything that's got a box around it is a person that shows up in the New Testament. So you've read about these people. The ones in purple were rulers or kings of certain areas. So we have Herod the Great, of course. And I mentioned he he was paranoid. You saw where he killed off all his wife's family, essentially. I mentioned he did execute her eventually. As part of his trying to consolidate power, he also killed off another wife's brother. Then he killed off one of the sons that came through the priestly line. Then he killed off the other son that came through the priestly line. I guess he was really worried about them trying to kill him off. And then he killed off another son that was from another person. So I don't know what the other four were thinking. I guess they were trying to hide so they didn't get killed. But he killed off all those and left the remainders were the ones that survived his lifespan. So Herod the Great died in 4 B.C. His kingdom is divided up among some of his remaining sons. Archelaus, if you recall, when Joseph had the dream to leave Bethlehem because Herod was going to try to kill the babies, he goes to Egypt. He comes back from Egypt. Archelaus was the ruler at the time, so that's why he decided not to stay in Bethlehem and went up to Nazareth. And I did, one thing I forgot to mention, I wanted to point out to all these people he killed. There are historical sources today, modern historians that say Herod didn't kill all the babies in Bethlehem. There's no record of that anywhere else except for the Bible. That's made up. Herod killed people left and right. He had no issue killing people. Bethlehem was a little backwater town. Most people estimate it maybe had 200 people in it. And if you figure how many babies, boys, 2 years old and younger, would have been in a town of 200 people, it's probably a handful. 5 to 10, maybe. Maybe. Would he have had any problem killing off 5 or 10 babies? No. He killed off his own sons. So there's nothing outside of reason to think this guy wouldn't have done that. And it's in the Bible, so we have it. But anyway, so when he dies, Archelaus gets control of the area of Bethlehem, so Joseph avoids that and goes to Nazareth. Now, some of the other ones that show up here. Herodias is a granddaughter. She marries her half-uncle. More weird stuff in this family. Half-uncle Herod Philip I. She has a daughter by him named Salome or Salome, which we don't have the name in the Bible, but we do have her in the Bible because you recall the story about the girl who danced for the king, and the king was so pleased with her that he said, you could have whatever you want. Well, that king was Herod Antipas, because Herodias divorced Herod Philip I, married another half-uncle, Herod Antipas, and Josephus, the great Jewish historian, gives us her name as Salome. But so if you recall, Herodias was upset because John the Baptist was preaching against her because she divorced the one uncle and married another uncle. And so this is when she asked for the head of John the Baptist. That's this guy named Herod Antipas here, who shows up in various places in the New Testament. There is another brother, Herod Philip II, shows up in the book of Luke chapter 3. So again, you've read all these. And one of the reasons I did this because I kept getting confused. I'm like, who are all these Herods? Herod died. Why is there more of them showing up? Well, it's the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. So I think this is helpful to see who all these people were. So Herod Agrippa I, kind of in the middle, was the guy that basically proclaimed himself a god. Mentions he was, so in Acts chapter 12, he's getting all this adoration. He was out at a big event wearing a silver robe, and this is like a god. And so God said, nope, you're not. And he's the one that God fell down and sick, and he was eaten up with worms, it said, and died. So over here, this guy Felix on the bottom right shows up in Acts 24. He's one of the ones that has Paul imprisoned, and he's questioning Paul. We see Paul giving a defense before him. He was married to one of Herod the Great's granddaughters. And then there in the middle, Herod Agrippa II and Bernice were also grandchildren of Herod the Great, great-grandchildren of Herod the Great. And Paul gives a defense before them as well. That's later on in Acts 25 and 26. And he's the one that basically says, Paul, do you think you can convince me to be a Christian? And that's that guy right there, Herod Agrippa II, who always traveled with his sister Bernice. Historical speculation that they were maybe a little more than brother and sister too. It was kind of a weird family. If you think the stuff we see on reality TV now with all the just junk that's out there, they could have been a reality TV show, this whole family. But same issues that we see today, they had back then. But anyway, Herod Agrippa II, Paul gave a defense before him, grandchild of Herod the Great. Yes, sir.
You got Herod Philip the first going down to Herodias, and Herod Antipas going to Herodias.
Yep.
What
So Herod Philip I was her first husband. She divorced him and married Herod Antipas. Both of them were half uncle. Yeah. They're both her half uncles. She married both of them. Yeah. So anyway, that's the family of Herod, and I think it is important to try to understand this when you start reading the gospel accounts in the book of Acts to figure out who these people are and how they fit into the Bible. These are real people that were out there that show up. So I think we're about done. And this lastly, this thing of the things about Herod, of course, right there in the middle of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, he was responsible for that. It's one of the largest projects of the ancient world to create this giant retaining wall to build, and where he upgraded the temple that, of course, sat on top of it. Very huge stones, retaining wall, 37 acres, took about 70 years to try to finish it, and by the time they got it done, it was just a few years later that the Romans wiped it out because, of course, we didn't need the temple anymore. We had Jesus Christ. So that was done away with. So anyway, about used up all my time here. I hope this wasn't like completely boring, and maybe it gives you a picture of how the Bible unfolds in terms of secular history and the pieces how that fits together. Any other questions or comments?
We hear a lot right now about the statement from the river to the sea.
Mm-hmm.
If you go back and look at that, the first map,
Yeah.
Israel occupied pretty much to what God gave him at that period of time, from the Euphrates to the...
When Solomon was in charge, yeah. Yeah.
Of course, they want Jews completely out of that land.
Right.
That's where that statement, sea to the
Right.
river to the sea.
Yes, yeah, that's right. If you didn't hear that, the current political environment, the river to the sea, with the Palestinians wanting to take over all that land again. Now, one important thing to remember, and I always want to point out, this is history. It's the Bible history. It lets us know how that lays out. But modern Israel has nothing to do with this and Bible history. It's not these. Here, people talking about prophecies of restoring it again and rebuilding the temple. That's not in the Bible. We're not going to have another temple. We've already got that by the name of Jesus Christ.
What's at the bottom of that picture, Craig?
I took this. I'm standing on the top of the Mount of Olives, looking down into the Kidron Valley. So that now is a huge cemetery. So you're seeing the crypts that all sit above ground. It's covered one side to the other with that. In fact, there's one on the other side right below the Temple Mount. That's the Arabic side, Palestinian side, and the Mount of Olives is the Jewish cemetery side. Any other questions, comments? Didn't put everybody to sleep. All right, thank you. We'll see you all in a few minutes for worship.